Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our, I think this is our first Meet VC Authors event of the spring semester at the HRC. I'm Christina Stanch. I'm a professor of English here, and I direct the HRC. Assisting me today in preparing this event are my colleagues Ellie Musgrave and Hilary Levinson, our assistant director, who will help moderate the Q&A portion and discussion of this webinar. Um, as the director of the HRC, it's my job to let you know about some of the events we are hosting this semester. Ellie will post our events link in the chat if you're new to the center. This is what we are all about. If you'd like to sign up to learn more in our monthly newsletter, you can also do that. And last week, we launched our 2025 annual report with lots of great stories about our mission. So if you'd like to check them out, you will have a link in the chat as well. Today's event is in our Meet VCU Authors series, invites invites our colleagues and students, both from VCU and from other universities, to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recent publications and answer questions about their work. Because of our continued success with these webinars, our attendees now hail from many states in the U.S. and from several countries abroad. So we keep this online format, although we also meet in person for other types of events, and then we publicize a lot of these recordings, most of these recordings, on our YouTube channel. For me, Meet VC Authors is also a time of celebration as publications, especially in the humanities, take quite a few years to complete. And so I hope in your questions and your comments today, you will also acknowledge in your generosity. Our event today will have a brief introduction of our speakers today, and then who'll take about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have ample time for questions from the audience. And just a note, we'll only be recording the first portion of the event, Dr. Coogan's introduction, which you can access later on our YouTube channel. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you three wonderful scholars at VCU, the co-editor of the book we are highlighting today, The Cambridge Companion to American Prison Writing and Mass Incarceration, published this past October by Cambridge University Press, and two of the authors whose chapter appears in the book. A large-scale and wonderful project, the Cambridge Companion to American Prison Writing and Mass Incarceration tells the story of mass incarceration in America through the writers who experienced it firsthand. From the onset of mass incarceration in the early 1970s to the 21st centuries, the collection brings together accounts from figures including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, political activist Assata Shakur, journalist Wilbert Rideau, and many others. Leonard Peltier, of course, which is also one of my favorite authors. With us today are our colleagues David Coogan, as I mentioned, the book's editor, who is joined by Dr. Liz Canfield, as well as doctoral student and teaching associate Becca Ringel. Dr. Canfield and soon to be Dr. Ringel authored one of the chapters. Please allow me to introduce them very briefly. Dr. Coogan is a colleague of mine, dear colleague in the English department. He is the founder of Open Minds, a college program at the Richmond City Jail, and the author of other books. The most recent one is Writing Our Way Out, Memoirs from Jail, published in 2015, written with 10 formerly incarcerated men. He's also the director of a criminal justice diversion program based on that book. He has published numerous articles on rhetoric, the teaching of writing, and prison literature, including The Rhetoric of Redemption in African American Prison Memoirs in 2021, and Situating Agency in the Memoirs of Mass Incarceration in 2020, both of them in a Rhetoric Review. Dr. Liz Canfield is an associate professor. Is actually a full professor, sorry, is a full professor in gender, sexuality, and women's studies here at VCU, where she teaches introductory courses in gender sexuality studies, upper level courses in feminist literary theory, queer theory and cinema, and service learning courses that engage the prison system in Virginia. She's an affiliate faculty in African American Studies Department and the Department of English, or soon to be Language and Literature. She's a co-editor of Open Minds with Dr. Coogan and the co-director of the Transformative Justice Collaborative Learning Lab at the HRC, which is an interdisciplinary research activist and artist space for VCU faculty and members of the Richmond community. She has presented creative and academic work nationally and internationally, and her interests include radical pedagogy, transformative technologies, decolonial queer epistemologies, and emancipatory ontologies of self and community. Last but not least, Becca Ringel is a doctoral student and teaching associate in English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, with research interests in American literature, feminist rhetoric, and critical prison studies. Their recent master's thesis, Grabbing for Life, Rhetorical Space and Agency in Women's Prison Zines, was awarded the Virginia Commonwealth University's Graduate School's 2023-2024 Outstanding Master's Thesis Award in the Humanities and Fine Arts category. So this is quite a wonderful lineup. Congratulations to the three of you, and welcome to VC Authors. Dr. Coogan, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Stanchu, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for being here to share this space with us on the webinar. The Cambridge Companion to Mass Incarceration in American Prison Writing tells the story of mass incarceration through the eyes of the writers who lived through it. And this is not the way the story is typically told, through the policies and politics that led to that tragedy. We know how that story goes. In 1970, the prison population in America was about 300,000. By 2010, it was 2.3 million. America, with only 5% of the world's population, has 25% of the world's prisoners. How did we become the world's largest jailer in 40 years? We know that the wars on crime and drugs in the 1970s and 1980s under Republican presidents Nixon and Reagan spurred much of the growth. We know that the Criminal Justice Reform Act of the 1990s under President Clinton made tough on crime a bipartisan issue. We know that these policies impact poor, Black, and brown people more so than middle-class and wealthy white people who have a more privileged relationship to the law, the police, and the courts. We know that men of all races outnumber women in prison, but in the recent era of mass incarceration, women have been incarcerated at a faster rate than men, the fastest of all for Black women. We did not become the world's largest jailer over 40 years because we had the most crime. Mass incarceration has become a solution for people contending with structural racism, poverty, unemployment, underemployment, homelessness, untreated mental health issues, trauma, and addiction. Incarceration does not solve these problems, it just sends them away. And yet, as the prison system expanded in the early 1970s to control the narratives of the most vulnerable people in society, more vulnerable people began sharing their narratives. The rise of mass incarceration paralleled the rise of the genre of memoir, and more broadly, the democratization of publishing. Voices unheard or unknown in public discourse were now being heard, including the voices from mass incarceration. Let me take a minute to push back on the phrase mass incarceration. In physics, mass refers to the total amount of matter in an object, the grains of sand in the glass, the amount of water in that glass. A drop of water or a grain of sand does not matter. It's the total mass that matters. So too with mass incarceration. Individuals become a part of an adjective modifying a noun describing the thing being done to them. But unlike other mass experiences, where we choose to be just a face in the crowd, a concert, a political rally, no one chooses mass incarceration. Anonymity only explains captivity. To write in prison is to break rank with the masses, to shape your fate, like the guy on the cover of the book that you see there on your screen, parting the waters of mass incarceration, holding them in abeyance as he makes his way to freedom. In our book, the story of mass incarceration is told in 3 parts, It begins with the revolutionaries in the 1960s and the 1970s, seeking liberation not just from prison, but from the oppressive structure of society that sustains it. It then shifts to the witnesses in the 1980s and 1990s, seeking self-determination and justice from these increasingly cavernous prison warehouses. It ends with the survivors in the 21st century, seeking healing from the psychological trauma that led to prison, as well as the trauma of prison. Let me share with you some of the highlights. One of the best-known revolutionary writers in prison was George Jackson. And here's an excerpt from Dylan Rodriguez's chapter explaining why. While George Jackson inhabits a significant, arguably singular place in the living archive of diasporic Black, radical, and global revolutionary intellectuals, he consistently identifies himself as an ordinary Black person inhabiting the historical, structural, anti-Blackness of the United States. His best-selling book, Soledad Brother, opens with an emblematic reflection written in correspondence with the editor who requested this autobiography. Against the exceptionalism of the Jeffersonian genre, Jackson offers a self-narrative that immolates the American dream while setting the terms for a permanent state of rebellion against white individualism. Quote from Jackson, Black men born in the U.S. and fortunate enough to live past the age of 18 are conditioned to accept the inevitability of prison. For most of us, it simply looms as the next phase in a sequence of humiliations. Being born a slave in a captive society and never experiencing any objective basis for expectation had the effect of preparing me for the progressively traumatic misfortunes that lead so many Black men to the prison gate. I was prepared for prison. It required only minor psychic adjustments. Jackson introduces himself to the reader with unapologetic transparency. His writing exhibits vulnerability, nuance, and thoughtfulness, as well as a principled incorrigibility that expresses a generalized lifelong suspicion and rejection of the legitimacy of dominant, disciplinary, oppressive institutions. Jackson again writes, I could play the criminal aspects of my life down some, but it wouldn't be me. That was the pertinent part, the thing at school and home I was constantly rejecting in process. Against the telos of many carceral prison narratives, this collection of letters reflects the developing thought of a Black liberationist, carceral insurrectionist, and diasporic revolutionary whose primary political and cultural work is not primarily focused on achieving his personal freedom, release from prison, but rather on organizing and proliferating radical ruptures of an existing oppressive order, what Jackson famously identifies in his book, Blood in My Eye, as perfect disorder. Here's Jackson again. The enemy culture, the established government, exists first of all because of its ability to govern, to maintain enough order to ensure that a cycle of sorts exists between the various levels and elements of the society. Law and order is their objective. Ours is perfect disorder. Our aim is to stop the life cycle of the enemy culture and replace it with our own revolutionary culture. That was from Dylan Rodriguez's chapter. As tough-on-crime policies were aggravated during the 1970s and 1980s, leading to longer prison sentences, overcrowding, and a loss of educational and rehabilitative programming, revolutionary movements retrenched. The era of prison warehousing had begun. In it, writers began witnessing to the long-term psychological impact of a system built on brutality and cruelty. One of those witnesses was Kenneth Hartman, a self-described state-raised convict and author of the award-winning memoir, Mother California, A Story of Redemption Behind Bars. Here's an excerpt from his chapter about Jack Henry Abbott, another state-raised convict contending with the promise of change. I can remember clearly when I heard about Jack Henry Abbott's tragic, senseless return to prison for delivering a stab to a man's heart. At that time, I was fresh into the system, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at Folsom State Prison in California. It was one of those moments that left us all inside feeling both numb and empathetic. The numb part came from the helplessness all of us state-raised convicts feel deep underneath the big droopy mustaches and dark green tattoos. The convict code in America, particularly for the white convicts, was one of utter stoicism and self-control. Here was a man, one of us, who had beaten the odds and been released as a kind of celebrity due to writing about his horrific experiences, but who had carried out with him the twisted mores of prison. The empathetic part reflected our sense of the futility of our lives. This man had managed to slip out of the grasp of prison, but the prison held on to his heart. The misspoken word, the perceived gesture of combat had awakened in him his prison training. Be prepared to fight or get ready to die. While Abbott and I never crossed paths, he being of the previous generation, we would not have been strangers. I spent more than 40 years of my life incarcerated in juvenile and adult prisons, ultimately serving almost 38 continuous years for killing a man in a fistfight over misspoken words. My triggers were also activated, and my reactions were also directly connected to my experiences growing up inside. There was a dark kinship. Abbott understood his own limitations and recognized the perils of parole. The final words in his magnificent book, In the Belly of the Beast, are, "I do not know how I feel at being given a parole. The thought of legally being free from prison has receded from my mind, my feelings, so long ago that I honestly do not recall a time when I ever had plans or hopes of ever being a free man in this country in my life. Maybe later I can write about it, but not now. The ability to see beyond the fences is hard, even for the most thoughtful of prisoners. The thought of being released from prison is also terrifying to even the most hardened of men. When Abbott expresses his confusion and relates how he had erased the possibility from his mind, I can feel his struggle personally. I too, after many long years inside, had erased the possibility from my mind. Reopening that possibility was fraught with the justifiable fears of an unknown that is known to be a battleground from which many of us return bruised and battered. The prison system fails miserably at preparing people for release. It's only successful for preparing them for a life inside. We know this, and it's something that plagues us all, and thus has it ever been in this country. That was Kenneth Hartman writing on Jack Henry Abbott. By the end of the 20th century, mass incarceration had become embedded within the political and economic landscape of America. It was and remains popular with Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Although the total prison population went down under President Obama, we still have mass incarceration. The damage is ongoing. One of the ways in which that damage presents is in the literature of imprisoned people that addresses the trauma of incarceration as well as the trauma leading into it. In her chapter on women's prison writing from this era, Maura Marquis describes that dynamic as tragic but also paradoxical. Authors are often told writing should be drawn first and foremost from lived experience. For many criminalized women authors, their lives are shaped by trauma, which complicates this seeming truism. As Kathy Caruth explains it in her groundbreaking work, Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative, and History, trauma is the repeated experience of a past painful event that one cannot simply leave behind. This is due to the shock of the traumatic experience, which prevents conceptual assimilation and resists future retelling. Trauma is simply too violent, incomprehensible, because it is at odds with expectations, occurs too fast to mentally process, disrupts an established worldview so thoroughly that the harm it causes isn't experienced as it unfolds, even as its specter continues to haunt the writer's life. And yet, like a ghost, its reality is doubled. As Caruth writes, trauma is not only the reality of the event, but also the reality of the way that its violence has not yet been fully known. How can you tell a story about something you don't remember? How can you explain something you don't understand? Barbara Parson Lane's story is common for many criminalized women. She's a survivor, Parsons Lane shot and killed her husband, who had physically and sexually assaulted her routinely and threatened to kill her repeatedly. Her narrative begins from the vantage point of her incarceration. But before she recounts the circumstances that led to it, she returns to her childhood. She writes, "Childhood memories are like an old puzzle taken out off the shelf. You open the box, finger the pieces. But old puzzles can be frustrating. They refuse to fit, are bent, or misplaced. Some pieces are lost forever." Parsons Lane's description of her memory as piecemeal maps neatly onto Carruth's explanation of trauma's effect, an inability to reconcile partial and confounding recollections. Parsons Lane's story begins when she was raped at 4 years old by her grandfather. She tells her mother and is told not to ever mention it again. Parsons Lane's right, and I don't. I become a quiet girl. Parsons Lane's experience is a singular act of violence compounded by her mother's refusal to care for her daughter or hold her father accountable. Yet, we learn that Parsons Lane's mother was also first a victim. When Parsons Lane is 17, her mother commits suicide by jumping from the 12th floor of a building. At this time, Parsons Lane finally breaks her silence, telling her aunt about her rape, and is told her mother was also raped by the same man. But her mother's status as survivor only complicates Parsons Lane's suffering. She asks, "How could mom stood at the window and watched me walk hand in hand with grandpa down Route 7? How could someone who knows firsthand the trauma of such violence allow it to be enacted on their child?" It doesn't help Parsons Lane to understand that in between her abuse and her mother's suicide, her mother threatened, hit, and threw things. Once a pot of peas boiling away on the stove, another time a plastic hairbrush that hit so hard it broke in two against my arm. Parson Lane's narrative recounts these details matter-of-factly in a list of other profoundly traumatic events, including the death of her brother, her mother's schizophrenia, and finally her abusive husband, whose behavior Parson Lane likens to her mother. These are peppered through her story like the details of setting in realist fiction. But unlike those details, these overwhelm the narrative, leaving the reader with a feeling of surreality. How is so much violence possible, one may ask? Why does no one intervene? Where are all the kind adults in this child's life? How can one person suffer so much ill fortune? One of the ways that Parsons Lane addresses that suffering is through her writing. The worst part about prison, she explains in her memoir, is being separated from her children. How fitting it is that she ends her memoir, the story of her life, with the voices of her children, sharing how her incarceration has impacted them. Mass incarceration has depended upon this pernicious othering of people struggling for justice and deliverance in prison and in the lives leading into prison. The writings of revolutionaries, witnesses, and survivors resist the construction of them as a mass of unredeemable others. Revolutionaries teach us how to diagnose the underlying structural problems of the criminal justice system and pathways to liberation. Witnesses carry that light into the darkest cells to bring back the testimony of people persevering to determine their own fates. And survivors show us how people in prison can heal from the trauma in their past while resisting the perpetuation of it in the present.